Podcasts.
Hi, and welcome to the Volume Podcast. There are many definitions of the word volume. We will begin with one that is directly connected to the most obvious, quantity. But in this case, right now, it relates to the feelings or sensations that piles up and sneak up on us. It's when we realize the challenges ahead on our day or in our future. It's overwhelming, omnipresent. It's loud and yet silent. It's the understanding that the volume of problems we have to solve is just too big. It overflows. This podcast series will be about people who can help us understand what's happening now and its effect in our future. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the Volume Podcast.
Hi, my name is Jakli. I actually just finished my Ph.D. in political science at UC Berkeley. I've been a research fellow at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and at the Stanford Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law for the last 2 years. I'm actually also finishing up my time at Stanford this summer, and then I'll be moving on to a 3-year position at Harvard at the Harvard Society of Fellows. I am originally a comparativist who got really excited about political behavior and methodology. And so my research now kind of crosses these 3 subfields within political science.
So Laura, tell us what's in you that drove you to this research that we're going to talk about.
So I'm actually from Hungary, and growing up there and then moving to the US, I would go back every summer. And every summer I would see a huge distinct shift in the political conversation and really even the political culture of the country. So we're talking about like the pre-accession period to the beginning of joining the EU in 2004, and then kind of watching that development to the right-wing Fidesz government taking over in 2010, and really how the conversation has changed since then, especially around immigration, refugees and asylum, the rise of Euroscepticism, and all these other types of movements in the country, and now obviously going into what we might no longer call a democracy. So growing up, watching those developments and basically coming back and seeing these distinct changes really drove me to be interested in the behavioral aspect of comparative politics, and specifically in issues like political extremism, right-wing extremism, democratic decline, authoritarian encroachment, and how all of these things might be related, and how the way we receive information nowadays could be contributing to the types of developments I'm seeing in my own country, and obviously patterns I'm seeing in other neighboring countries and other countries in the world that kind of mimic the Hungarian experience.
Interesting. So tell us a little bit about your research and what did you find?
So my dissertation is actually titled Estimating Extremism. And so the premise of the dissertation is just to say that contemporary political extremism, be it far-right extremism and or far-left extremism, is still not only under-conceptualized, but we haven't developed more innovative ways to measure it and to measure how a democracy kind of heads in that direction and towards political extremes. The other kind of phenomenon that I was really fascinated by is looking at polling numbers, especially in European elections over the last 10 years, and how we just couldn't get far-right vote share correctly before any parliamentary election. So there was a systematic underestimation of how these far-right parties would perform. And then we kind of saw different moments of misestimation more broadly with Brexit, with Trump's election, with all these other kind of what I would call, right-wing social movements. And so I started thinking, okay, why are we not getting any of this right? And how do I come up with better ways for us to understand who has either hidden sentiment that kind of matches these movements, or who is headed in a more extreme direction in terms of their political viewpoints. And so the goal of my research for the last few years has been to develop these measures. And then the secondary task or the secondary objective, of course, is to then take these measures and kind of combine them or find ways to connect them to the digital age and how the consumption of information in the digital world leads us down these kinds of political pathways.
So one thing that I find fascinating in research is the idea that people will identify themselves as far-right when they see there are other people identify themselves as well. So tell us a little bit about this.
Right. So there's a few different things to talk about here. The first is that if you look at the public opinion research over the last 20 or 30 years in the European Social Survey or any of these broader social surveys, you're not seeing huge upticks now in sort of far-right beliefs or far-right preferences in these surveys. They've actually been pretty consistent over that period. So that's super fascinating because at the same time you're having this like period of stability in public opinion surveys, you're not having any kind of stability in what the politics looks like around that, right? So if people were very anti-immigration or some subset of people were very anti-immigration in Europe, all the way leading back to the 1980s, 1990s in these surveys, why is it now that they're acting on it, right? So that's kind of one of the main kind of puzzles that drove some of my work. And this leads me to this concept of contingent extremism that shapes a bit of my dissertation and is actually a standalone paper I'm submitting this summer finally. And that's this concept that a lot of people have hidden extreme preferences, but we also have these very strong inclinations towards mainstream beliefs and mainstream viewpoints, and none of us want to be thought of as politically extreme. So it's these two interesting things that coexist in people, and what that leads to is kind of a repression of things that you might have preferred all along, or kind of not necessarily repression, but just something that you're not really coming to terms with or battling. It's just something that's not shaping your politics all the time. But these beliefs are there, and obviously when they kind of come to be legitimized in the mainstream political space, then it's really quick to activate. So my argument is not, all of a sudden these people who didn't have these inclinations before are now a huge voting bloc. The argument is this was always something we could mobilize on. It's just there wasn't an opportunity to really do so. And there's two ways in which that mobilization occurred in the last decade, especially. One of them I find is about your local representation. So what far-right parties do really, really well in Europe is they create enclaves of legitimacy. So they create these local areas where they've really invested heavily in resources and really invested heavily in making connections with voters. And their support grows super, super quickly. So you have parts of East Germany, for example, where the Alternative for Deutschland gets, 20 or more percent of votes in elections. And obviously other parts of Germany where it's pretty close to 0%. And this is a trend you see with all of these parties. Same thing with like agrarian parts of France, where Marine Le Pen's party is incredibly popular, can get up to 30, almost 40% of votes in certain elections. And other parts of France are thinking, what's going on here? Obviously, nobody here is a Le Pen supporter. So what's going on there is you basically build up these enclaves of legitimacy. And for those people who live in these areas, it's then a much more comfortable social space to kind of start admitting extremist preferences in and party support in. And this actually ends up shaping the national conversation as well, because all of a sudden you get these news stories about some small region of France where Le Pen is the most popular, or some, East German district where the AfD outperformed any other party. And so when you have hidden extremists in these other parts of Germany or France or, other countries, they see this popularity and these spikes, and it changes their own understanding of how compatible their own extreme viewpoints are with mainstream preferences. So there's a local story going on. And then on top of this, there's a media story going on, right? So we exist more and more in echo chambers. And the way this plays out is if you already had these types of underlying preferences and now you're gravitating towards news stories that play up how successful these parties are, news stories that only report the positive polls about these kinds of more extreme parties, you're existing in an environment where it's becoming legitimized, even though if you talk to people from other quote unquote echo chambers, you wouldn't have that same kind of mental movement towards, yes, this is legitimate. Yes, this is a mainstream viewpoint. So we have asymmetric information, and this is absolutely feeding into these kinds of asymmetric understandings of how popular and legitimate these viewpoints are.
So it's interesting that this happens not only in that specific area, but also in so many different countries.
Yeah.
So what part do you think social media plays on this?
Sure. There's two elements of this, as you mentioned. There's the mass element and there's the elite element. And the mass element is basically, so the average person who has some extreme preferences and viewpoints is kind of quasi-statistically monitoring their information environment for signals that this viewpoint is legitimate and for signals that this viewpoint is illegitimate. And when enough people around you are saying, you know, this is wrong, I can't believe you think this, you really quickly kind of go back into a place where you don't openly support this, maybe are kind of deactivated as an extremist. When you have kind of a critical threshold of people that are now egging you on and saying, absolutely, I've always thought this too, I can't believe nobody else is saying this, you obviously have a different kind of transformation in terms of how active you are with these opinions and how likely you are to be mobilized on them in an upcoming election. And so from a massive standpoint, this is where these like critical thresholds of extremists in different echo chambers and information enclaves make a huge difference for your own activation as an extremist. From an elite standpoint, this work is actually more prevalent in sociology than in some of political science, which I find interesting. But basically, there are really interesting arguments about how once one or two kind of important news elites legitimize a far-right leader or invite them onto their shows and kind of engage with them like these are completely legitimate conversations to be having, people who are, once again, these contingent or hidden extremists are also following these types of news cycles and realizing, okay, this is a legitimate conversation, right? There's no reason for us not to talk about immigration in X, Y, or Z terms. So there's a mass element, and that's about how many signals you receive from your peers that either, you know, kind of stigmatize your viewpoint or destigmatize your viewpoint. But there's a very similar type of activation, deactivation going on in the elite space. And it's really hard to know which of these is more important and when it's really the elite drivers that are causing somebody to become activated versus the mass drivers. I would like to do more work that disentangles this, but I definitely think it's a story of both things simultaneously.
And do you see any changes in algorithms, especially in the attention economy of like places like YouTube play a big part on this?
Yeah. Unfortunately, YouTube is not studied enough in our literature, and there's finally starting to be a movement towards it. And they have a great API actually for people to use if they're interested in doing research on this. I'm just starting to work with it. Everybody was really focused on Facebook and Twitter and Google and kind of going after these companies and the roles they play and kind of algorithmically biasing things and or playing into extremist hands. But, you know, there's more video content on YouTube as of today, if I remember correctly from a paper I read, than there is, you know, on all of television, right? So a lot of content is being produced. A lot of underemployed and or discontented people, especially younger men, are watching these videos and consuming these kinds of echo chambers at alarming rates. And so, yeah, we need a lot more work on this. Now, the question of are there actual algorithmic biases, really, really, really difficult to pin down. There's some computer scientists that have kind of used these like random walk algorithms to see, all right, if I start at a conservative video, but that's not extreme conservative or not extreme far right, can I get there within a few video recommendations to a place where I'm in some kind of extremist rabbit hole? And I would say most of the work on this is super inconclusive at the moment. I don't think that the algorithm works, from what I understand in the literature, as, you're just browsing completely mainstream things and boom, all of a sudden you're in an extremist rabbit hole. So it's not that radicalization works like this. I think radicalization works in much more benign ways where, you look up somebody because their really extreme opinion went viral or their very controversial opinion went viral, and then you start watching their videos. So it is you self-selecting, but that's still an issue nonetheless, even if it's not the algorithm kind of forcing you to interact with extreme material. So I think we need to shift the conversation more so from, are there biases? Not that it's not an interesting question, but also to supply and demand, and how supply and demand for these types of content have changed over time, and what it means for YouTube to be supplying so much of it. So I think the question of the internet and the role it plays is actually pretty unique in Hungary in 2020 compared to, say, the United States or even Brazil. So in Hungary, there's so much state-controlled media now that kind of is oriented towards this direction, that really the internet is the space where more mainstream Democratic candidates can go and share their viewpoints and share counter arguments to what I would consider more right-wing extreme views in my country. So, this idea that if we just regulate the internet or if we fix biases, we'll have more democracy, it is a lot more complicated, especially once these leaders come to power and come to have more influence over traditional media. So I don't think it's as simple of a kind of discussion as, okay, we need to censor what kind of views get on the internet, because clearly these views can permeate traditional media. Clearly these views can permeate traditional institutions in any country. And in that specific instance, you need a lot of counter voices that are not heavily regulated to balance it out. But I would say that there needs to be a lot more focus in these tech companies on behavioral research and how users interact with different features of the platforms to better understand how somebody gets really sucked into certain types of content. Now, I do think this research is happening. I think it just didn't come about until more recently. And a lot of it is happening in-house rather than really giving academics free access to this kind of information. That's a really hard game to play because obviously privacy concerns, various legal concerns that these companies legitimately have about sharing this type of information. But there needs to be a better understanding, both from the academic perspective and within industry, of what the psychological consequences are. And of course, this can work against a company's bottom line. There's no reason that YouTube would not want people watching hours and hours and hours of content, because that's the purpose of the platform. And so there needs to be a stronger kind of focus on the ethics of certain psychological designs and features that are built into these products, and what is worth it and what is not worth it for the company's bottom line.
So what are your feelings when you go back home or when you read the news? There's some very scary anti-democratic movements happening there. So how does that affect you? How do you feel about that?
So I definitely have hope, because you have to have hope, that there are a lot of people who are discontent with some of the more extreme measures the government has taken, especially in the COVID period. I do think that my general observation is, there's just not enough diversity in information and diversity in news for people to be as angry as they might have to be to really channel this into voting for a different party. And so that's kind of the conundrum we're stuck in as a country. I do think that there's this interesting dynamic where we always talk about how the far right has kind of gone global, right? And so that means you can not necessarily even be mobilized by your own party leaders or by local elites, but you can be mobilized by Le Pen as an American, or AfD as a Frenchman, or Bolsonaro as a Canadian. So we're kind of in this interesting space where the diffusion of these types of viewpoints leads to kind of like a global kind of pop legitimization, right? So somebody who's not even domestically involved in your sphere can kind of help legitimize your own views because of YouTube and because of all these other resources we have to follow people that are outside of our sphere of quote unquote influence. But there's the same thing in the other direction. So there's a lot of Hungarians who, very carefully follow other European leaders and other EU leaders and what they have to say about Hungary's government. And there's a lot of partnerships at the EU level to kind of help these other parties kind of get a little bit more attention. And so I think there's also this hopeful side of social media, at least in a space like Hungary, where the diffusion of democratic ideas and the diffusion of less extreme views can also be helpful and influential in Hungarian elections. Now, how much we want these conversations to be global and how much autonomy we want countries to have over who votes for whom is also a difficult conversation to have. And obviously not all of this is about foreign interference in elections. Some of this conversation is just, what leaders are you paying attention to get your information about your own country? I don't think we've really grappled with that in political science because it's a little bit too new of a phenomena to have done so.
So as a thought exercise, in 10 years ahead, what do you think you would be updating your research with?
So there's a few different things. One, currently when I do any kind of supervised machine learning or computational text analysis, I'm just using text, right? And a lot of what's changing people's hearts and minds and a lot of what's influencing especially younger demographics are videos, audio, podcasts, memes. And this is all stuff that political scientists and computer scientists and others are now working on better examining in a systematic way. I just think the machine learning tools at the moment are, still weak on this frontier. I think we're really, really good at analyzing text and, analyzing other types of data that people interact with. We're still pretty far behind on. So I'm really hopeful for how quickly that will advance over the next 10 years and what kind of information we can get out of, hundreds of thousands of millions of hours of YouTube videos, out of memes that are on, Reddit and different platforms, and kind of building a more solid foundation for understanding the sphere of influence in those terms. I think the other thing that's going to change in the next 10 years is we're going to really need to focus on platforms other than Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., because that's just not where young people are consuming their information. And as they become more influential actors, we really need to think creatively about how to access these other spaces of conversation. One way in which this is really, really hard is obviously the rise of peer-to-peer encrypted platforms like WhatsApp, and how that changes what researchers really have available in their toolkit to kind of monitor these conversations and monitor the quote-unquote sphere of influence.
Yeah, so talking about WhatsApp, I'm sure you're aware how the Brazilian model worked. Since many Brazilians do not have data, but they do have free WhatsApp, they would receive the message with the fake news or just an image of like a magazine or a newspaper cover with fake information, and they wouldn't be able to confirm if that was fake or not.
Yeah, so I was on the Kofi Annan Commission on Elections and Democracy in the Digital Age this whole last year. And we actually did some work in Sao Paulo and went to Brazil because we really wanted to think harder about peer-to-peer encrypted platforms and the role they play in how we consume information. And yeah, what you're describing is exactly correct. And it's going to become an even bigger issue in upcoming elections because where else is WhatsApp used by almost everyone? I mean, India, this is going to be really important in upcoming Indian elections. But in much of the world, right? Brazil was just kind of like the first big model case of just how important this can be. And I think there are steps that the platform has taken to limit like how many times you can forward a message and some of these like basic structural changes you can do to kind of reduce the effects of virality in this space. But I think what needs to be done, just based on my understanding of what's going on, is unfortunately there's not enough kind of efforts by other parties to kind of also diffuse or also distribute counter speech in WhatsApp. And so there's not enough of a kind of effort to say, fine, they're going to engage people using these tools. We should do the same thing and also kind of make messages go viral the same way they make messages go viral that are kind of counter speech. I think there's more and more people working on this, and there's more and more civic organizations that are getting really tech savvy with their messaging and how to make messages and more moderate frames and more democratic frames go viral. But we're kind of in this weird, defensive position with it because they learn to use it better and they learn to use it first. And so we're kind of, or we, meaning like people who are interested in more mainstream democratic discussion and less extreme viewpoints, are kind of playing a game where we're a little behind on how to get people interested in our content. And we need to be thinking very hard about that, especially because it's going to be so hard to like really go straight to regulation and censorship on like a peer-to-peer encrypted platform. I don't know how that's supposed to work. So what we really need to do is just use these same tools, but for very different types of argumentation and to do it better than them. So I'm hopeful that we can get there. But I think that's a conversation that needs to be had strategically by other parties in Brazil and by civic organizations in Brazil and in many, many other countries in the world.
So at the same time, it's amazing and also sad that the core of all this is pretty much people trying to connect. So people that connect to ideas, that connect to networks, and connect and create echo chambers, and that creates movement, and this movement creates political environments and political leadership, right?
Yeah. And I think, so your discussion there leads me to a really important study that came out recently on anti-vaxxers and how the anti-vaxxer community is much better at linking up with quote unquote like borderline individuals, and by borderline or sitting on the fence type of individuals, I mean people who are interested in anti-vax information but aren't sure that this is a valid way to go and have some questions. The anti-vax community online is really, really, really good at hooking up with those people, validating their concerns, and kind of drawing them into their communities to be more firmly anti-vax. Whereas the scientific community is not really engaging with these same type of like fence sitter individuals. If somebody has concerns about some kind of scientific fact or about some piece of information, they're not there to really kind of bring them back into the scientific conversation, right? So their strategy is just a lot more helpful for mobilization and for mobilizing a broad base. They're not saying, oh, the fact that you're not fully anti-vax means that you're, stupid. But some scientific community members might unfortunately shame that same individual for even having any concerns about vaccination, and that can kind of lead them to go in the more extreme direction. How we have that conversation and how we create linkages with quote unquote fence sitting or borderline individuals is really, really important in the social media network space, and kind of getting them back into our networks and into our spheres of influence and our spheres of information should be top priority. And it just, like, we just don't have that as a priority right now, I don't think, in the community. We're really not concerned with paying attention to those individuals, and we should be. And this conversation obviously translates to many other issues other than the anti-vax issue, but kind of shaming of borderline cases can lead to the kind of strengthening of echo chambers, and can lead people down these rabbit holes where people are willing to engage with them and willing to kind of facilitate their kind of hardening in certain viewpoints.
So, Laura, we're almost done, but I just want to ask you one last thing. Would you like to ask us a question?
Yeah, I mean, no, I would love to hear a little bit more about how Kunumi imagines the work of AI shaping the global political space, and also what your own viewpoints are on algorithmic bias, and how AI can kind of help correct for some of these, or better AI can help correct for these, or how bad AI can obviously contribute to the problems that we're facing.
Yeah, that's a great question. We are in this moment right now where we are shifting the organization towards something that we truly believe, which is we need to work with things that matter. I know there's a lot of people saying the same thing. I think that's awesome. We are still in the foundation of this process. We have found in the United Nations SDGs a resource, and we've been following some of the guidelines, or some of the targets that we want to, as humanity, try to reach. So we work in a very uneven society. We want to try to help in that direction, with more opportunities and equality in general. We also think that climate action is urgent, and we really want to focus our expertise on that. So it's not a small task, but it starts as a cultural change, like a true cultural change. And we've been, through our research, following that direction as well. So that's very interesting. We have two research right now on health that are very prominent. One, it's about COVID-19, and there's some very interesting findings on social inequality and mortality rates. And the other one, it's on a disease that we don't know much about, which is Alzheimer's disease. So by doing that, we try to create also opportunities for people to work in these projects and also do their own research. So we really want to help the people that are working with us to develop their own research and develop their own stories.
I definitely think that the social science conversation is shifting much, much more heavily to this, and we're building expertise incredibly quickly. It's just that this just started a few years ago, and concerns with these questions just started a few years ago. So we're like at the precipice of a lot of really impactful work coming out. We're just not quite there yet in terms of sophistication as a field. So I think it's good for you guys to be kind of revving up and giving us tools at the moment where we most need them, and the moment where interest in getting hands-on data about this and getting hands-on tools to help analyze this kind of information, it's really important. And just to kind of go back to that conversation where you said, you also mentioned healthcare, you also mentioned the economy, all of these things are obviously interlinked with the political conversation. So we can't really come to a place where we can comfortably say, in 2030, we'll have a more de-radicalized world, and we're going to work towards a more de-radicalized world without addressing these types of basic needs people are suffering from when it comes to health and economic equality, and how it's impacting their willingness to trust certain viewpoints, trust traditional politicians, kind of keeping them focused on spheres, quote unquote, spheres of information influence that we would like them to be engaging with, without discussing the discontent and the anger that all of these types of psychological things that I've been talking about are kind of built on, like the foundation that is kind of allowing these things to permeate.
So in a way, it's kind of hard to imagine a population questioning this when they are absolutely hungry and fighting for survival, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that this is a common response I have to people that say, oh, why aren't Hungarians more concerned about what's happening with the Supreme Court or with the control of some, newspaper? The answer is often, look, these are pretty abstract concepts in terms of democracy and democratic institution building. And when you have so many more direct concerns in your life, economically and with healthcare and with other types of issues, it seems like noise to you, right? That doesn't make you a bad person by any means. And I think we often get into this mindset as people that are very steeped in the conversation about democratic institutions of, how can somebody who's a good person let this happen? Well, they have much more primal concerns that haven't been addressed and unfortunately weren't necessarily even addressed by democratic leaders before, more extreme parties came to power. And so, yeah, we can't expect these super abstract concepts to matter to the average person on a day-to-day basis enough or as much as we would like them to. And so we really need to be reshaping the conversation and reaching these people in a way that actually draws them in and draws their attention and kind of matches their own everyday priorities. I want to kind of bring a little bit of attention to one bit of research that I'm currently doing that kind of is important for this conversation. I went through the 2 months of political ads hosted on Facebook in 12 European countries in the 2019-2020 period to look at how the far right messages and tries to mobilize people with their online political advertising in comparison to other political parties. And one of the first things that comes up if you just run some very, very basic sentiment analyses on the text of their advertising is they're the only ones that are really expressing a lot of negativity and anger and what we might call fear-related concepts in their advertising. And we have the tools to measure this, and it's one of the clearest findings in my data when I look at how is the far right quantitatively different than other parties and how they're attracting people. And I actually think that it's unfortunately a huge gap for other parties. If you're not also kind of showing people that you're angry at what's going on and kind of commiserating with them in their discontent, you're much less likely to really reach them at the level they need to be reached at. I don't know if it's necessarily good for all parties to be doing all this super negative, anger-filled advertising, but this is a strategy the far right seems to take across Europe in all of their more, semi-private, micro-targeted messaging. And it has consequences that other parties aren't really kind of trying to mirror people's own emotions as they're trying to appeal to them politically. So I think we need to do a lot more work in political behavior and especially comparative political behavior on thinking about what kind of emotive messaging makes people feel like you're on the same page as them as a political party and, kind of commiserating with them on the sources of their discontent. I just think that this is a strategy that we really haven't maximized yet in more mainstream political space.
Laura, thank you so much for being our first guest, and we look forward to talking to you again about your next researches.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really hope that people think a little bit more broadly about behavioral research when it comes to these AI conversations. And I'm really excited for what Kunumi is doing in this space.
The Volume Podcast.